So many people have been asking me about the refunds they're getting or the refunds they're not getting that I just wanted to jump in here and explain all the different money that you may or may not be receiving. So far, 3 refund payments have gone out. 3 stimulus payments have gone out. Officially, these are called economic impact payments. And here I'm going to use the abbreviation EIP. So we have EIP 1, 2, and 3. And that's also what it's going to look like if you got a direct deposit. It'll say EIP 1, 2, or 3. So we're going to talk about round 1, 2, 3, and also a little bit about the child tax credits. So round 1 went out between April and September. There were some people who were still getting them in November. If yours was not sent by the end of 2020, it will not be sent, and I'll explain what to do about that later. The round 2 went out for the most part. Almost everybody was getting them, I think, around January 6th, 4th, 5th, 6th, like that. I haven't seen any that were even sent out the second half of January. So if you didn't get EIP round 2, again, I'll talk about what to do, but you're not going to see it unless it's just in the mail. They're not sending any more EIP 2. Right now we're in round 3. So every day people are telling me, hey, I got my $1,400 or $2,800, and I'll explain what that is. But that just started. That was part of the bill that was just signed in March. And then we have child tax credits. Some changed, some didn't. So payment 1. Payment 1 was, I'm going to explain the numbers now so that you know when you get them, this is how much maybe you should have received. Again, if you got direct deposit, you're going to see on the direct deposit, it'll say something like Treasury, IRS, EIP 1 or EIP 2 or 3. And then that will be a good indication. So the round 1 was a lot more people got it by check, and now a lot more people have given their direct deposit information, so more people can get that. So people got checks, they got prepaid debit cards, and they also got direct deposits if the IRS had your information by the time that they sent your payment. A lot of people who were living abroad, specifically in Israel, got their payments sent about May 1st, which also coincided with the Israeli Post shutting down for a few days because of Corona. And those payments went back to the IRS. Some were canceled and not resent, and some were resent. Sometimes they were resent and then also bounced and also were canceled. So likely, if you didn't get it, it's not lost in the mail. You just need to apply again, and I'll explain that. Most of them aren't actually lost in the mail. So it was $1,200 per taxpayer. That's per person who filed, or $2,400 if you're married filing jointly. At plus $500 per eligible dependent, which was a dependent who was under 17 on the last tax return that was processed. So that on whatever tax return they looked at, either 2018 or 2019, if they looked at however many children, and they had to have social security numbers that were valid for that tax year to get it. Dependents 17 years and up were not eligible. So if you have your adult child or your parent living with you, they may be able to be claimed as a dependent for tax purposes, but for this payment, they were not eligible to get the additional $500. And somebody who was eligible to be claimed as a dependent, even if they were not claimed as a dependent, if they were eligible to be claimed as a dependent on anybody else's tax return, they were not eligible. That doesn't mean people didn't get them. They still applied for them. They still got them. As long as they weren't caught, they got them. Doesn't make it right, and they weren't really eligible. So last year, there was a non-filer system. This system was meant only for people who had no filing requirement, and they could put their information in the system. Last year also, people who didn't have direct deposit information in the system could also enter it there. There is no non-filer system this year, and as far as we know, they're not planning to open one. So if you didn't file a tax return and you are eligible, then you have to file an actual tax return. Still, the non-filer system you weren't supposed to use unless you really didn't have a filing requirement. So it's basically a simplified tax return. Payment 2 was $600 for everybody eligible. So $600 per taxpayer, per spouse, per eligible spouse with a social security number. So that's $1,200 filing jointly, and $600 for all the dependent children. And I think that was only based on 2019 tax returns. So I think that if your 2019 tax return was not filed by the time they looked at it, you just won't get it in this particular round of payments. Again, EIP1 could have been based on 2018 or 2019, depending on when you filed. Round 3 are the payments that are going out right now. It's $1,400 per individual. So it's $1,400 per taxpayer, per spouse, plus $1,400 for any dependents listed on the tax return. That can be the adult children, it can be grandma. Those all, for the most part, are being sent out automatically based on 2019. If your 2020 income is less, there is potentially a top-off payment, but only if the tax return is processed by a certain date. So, for example, if you had gotten a limited amount today because your income in 2019 was higher and then you filed 2020, you might see some more money soon. So here's just some examples of how much money you might be getting. If you're single, no kids, or married filing separately, no kids, like for example, your spouse is not a US citizen. So these are the amounts that you could expect to get if your income is under $75,000. So you may have gotten between 2020 and this current one, a total of $3,200. Now, let's say you're married with 2 children, which clearly is not the upper limit. You could have more than 2 children, but let's just say as on average, let's say you're married with 2 children and you file jointly and together you and your spouse make under $150,000. You could get between these 2 tax years up to $17,000, and that's not even including the 2021 child tax credits. Let's say that you filed your 2019 tax return last June. Also, sometime around June, you might have gotten the first EIP1. So in 2020, you could have gotten $3,400 and $2,800 for the child tax credit. And then these other 3 payments would come sometime during 2021. So you could get a total, just for having 2 children, $17,000. The reason I'm bringing these in here is because my point here is you're getting a bunch of money and maybe you want to know why. And you want to also make sure you got all the payments you were supposed to get. So if you're expecting child tax credits, those are also going to come in this time. Those are regular tax refunds. They rely specifically on the information that you filed on the specific tax form, specific year, and when you filed that. So it's up to $1,400 is the refundable portion. And that's for children under 17. So if they turn 17 already in that tax year, they're not eligible. And there are both maximums and minimums. I'm not going to go into the details, but that's the gist of it. You could have received up to $1,400 per child. You would know because this is based on a tax return. So it's not going to be a mystery amount coming from you. You should know that you're expecting that money. There are lots of changes. Which I'm not going to go into in detail because I'm mostly speaking to people who are outside the US. And the greater, very exciting $3,000, $3,600 amounts, you're not going to expect those if you're living outside the US. You should not be getting those. And if you're getting them, it's probably a mistake and you might have to pay it back. So it's really important. Don't go spend that money. Be careful. In order to be eligible for the increased child tax credits, you must have lived in the US for at least 6 months. And these start only in the tax year 2021. So that's normally the tax return you would file next year. However, they're sending out advance payments. So if you got an EIP, the first 3 refunds we talked about, and then your income went up, so you might not really be eligible, you do not have to pay it back. The child tax credit is not like that. You could have to pay it back if your income went up or if you got it and you weren't really living in the States. There's also, though, with this new child tax credit, there's no minimum. So really, they're just trying to give people money who might need the money. It's not like based on earnings. Please, if you're my client, make sure you're reading your emails from me. I will be in touch. The IRS is supposed to set up an opt-out so that people can opt out of getting these advanced payments. These are supposed to be monthly advanced payments, depending on how many children you have. So I'm going to strongly recommend that all of my clients, specifically clients living outside the US, which is most of my clients, opt out of this because they're not eligible and they're going to have a nasty surprise on their next tax return if they're excited about spending that money and then they have to pay it back. So please, please keep an eye on the IRS's website about that. It's not available as of today, March 18th, when I'm recording this, but keep watching. If you want more information about any of this, please go first to the IRS website. Here you can see the upper limits for those 3 payments. So if your income was over these limits, your payments would be phased out. If you have a bunch of kids, then it'll take longer to phase that out. The first 2 phase outs were 5% of your AGI above those limits. So that's how much you would come off of your payment. The third phase out was much more dramatic. So if you're over these limits, you're going to get very little or nothing. There's no lower limit for the EIPs, for these coronavirus stimulus payments. There's no lower limit. It's not like the child tax credits where you have to actually have income. And if you're trying to figure out what your AGI was, look at your last tax return. If you filed with a professional and you e-filed, you can look at the signature age. That's pretty much the easiest place to find it. It says AGI. It's one of the only 3 numbers on there. Or if you're looking at your main tax return form, page 1 of the actual tax return, look at line 8B for 2019. It's on different lines, different years, but for the most part, we're looking at line at 2019. Okay, so what do you do if you're missing refunds, you didn't receive it, or you didn't get the whole amount that you were entitled to? So there's what's called the recovery rebate credit. If you did not get the amounts you were entitled to for the first 2 rounds, that can be reconciled on your 2020 tax return. Those are the tax returns we're starting to file now. So I always recommend, specifically for people living outside the US, please use a professional, preferably in someone who specializes in working with people where you live. So most of my clients are in Israel. I specialize in working with people in Israel. I will take care of this for all my clients. You do not need to remind me. This is something I will do for everybody. I will check. I'm checking all of my clients' statements, transcripts to see how much they got and to make sure that they get the maximum that they're possibly entitled to. It's a form that goes with your 2020 taxes that will get you however much you are missing. So if your income in 2019 was a lot higher than 2020, maybe you weren't eligible for the full amount based on your 2019, and now you are, so you'll get the difference, whatever you're missing. There's a lot of very legal, interesting loopholes where it is possible to sort of get double for certain children. There's a lot of ways to get more, but in general, if you didn't get whatever you were entitled to, you'll get at least that if you're eligible now. If it is actually lost in the mail, then you may need to contact the IRS. But for the most part, I don't think they're really lost. If they went out and didn't get to you, most of them were canceled that I'm seeing. If you didn't file a tax return, that's another story. Or if you filed for the non-filer system, but you were supposed to file a real tax return, I did a whole separate video about that with my colleague, Hannah Rusik. So we discussed that, but please get in touch with a professional who specializes in your situation. So if you live abroad, you didn't file taxes in a long time, please get in touch with a specialist who specializes in working with US citizens in your country of residence and doing back taxes. Make sure things are handled correctly, because you can make a real mess of things if it's not done right. I really don't recommend just trying to quickly file to get these refunds. There will be a way to get them for a while. You're not going to completely miss out on them because you don't file today. There was a lot of misinformation going around. So really, if you haven't filed in a while, you really need to work with a professional on that.